The small town was quiet in the early morning hours. The streets were still empty, and the sun had only begun to paint the sky with soft orange light. Inside a modest house at the end of the lane, a father was already awake. He was a man of strength, but his strength came not from his muscles alone, it came from the heavy responsibilities he carried every day. His name was Daniel. His life had changed years ago when his only son, Ethan, was paralyzed after a tragic accident. Since that day, every morning began not with thoughts of himself, but with thoughts of his boy. Daniel walked into Ethan's room, where the child lay peacefully asleep. He stood for a moment just watching his son. Ethan was only 12 years old, yet his eyes carried the sadness of someone who had seen far more pain than any child should. The father's heart always ached when he remembered the accident, but he never let his son see his sorrow. He wanted Ethan to see only hope in his eyes, never despair. With gentle hands, he woke the boy and began the daily routine, lifting him carefully, helping him into his chair, preparing him for another long day of therapy and quiet hours. Life in that house had become simple, yet heavy. Daniel had given up his own dreams and comforts to dedicate himself to caring for Ethan. Friends admired him for his devotion, but many whispered behind his back saying the boy would never know a normal life again. They pitied the child and felt sorry for the father, thinking his sacrifices were only leading him into loneliness and exhaustion. But Daniel never listened to those voices. For him, Ethan was his world, and he would do anything to give his son a reason to smile again. Yet in the quiet of the night, when Ethan was asleep, Daniel sometimes sat alone and wondered if there was more he could do. Therapy was slow and painful, progress almost invisible. He worried that his son might grow up believing life had no joy waiting for him. The thought haunted him, and he promised himself he would find something, anything that could bring light back into Ethan's days. One afternoon, after dropping Ethan at a therapy session, Daniel wandered the streets with heavy thoughts. His eyes caught a sign that read, "Adoption Shelter and Give Them a Home." He paused. For years, Ethan had been fascinated by animals, especially dogs. He often read books about them and watched videos showing their loyalty and intelligence. Ethan once whispered to his father, "If I had a dog, maybe I wouldn't feel so alone." Daniel remembered those words now as he stood in front of the shelter gate. He hesitated, unsure if this was the answer. But something inside pushed him forward. He entered the shelter where rows of dogs barked, whined, and wagged their tails, each hoping for a new home. Some were small, some large, some shy, others full of energy. Daniel walked past the cages, looking at each pair of eyes staring back at him. Then he saw one dog sitting quietly in the corner. It was a German shepherd, strong, tall, with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to read his soul. Unlike the others, this dog did not bark or jump. He simply sat, calm and steady, watching Daniel with a gaze that was neither fearful nor aggressive. It was almost as if the dog was saying, "I know you. I understand." Daniel felt an unexplainable pull in his heart. He knelt down, and the dog tilted his head slightly, then moved closer, pressing his nose gently against the bars. A shelter worker walked over and said, "That one is special. We don't know his full story. He was found wandering the streets, no collar, no family. But he's different, quiet, smart, and patient. Most people overlook him because he isn't jumping around, but there's something in him." Daniel reached out his hand, and the German shepherd touched it softly with his paw. In that instant, Daniel felt a connection. He thought about Ethan, about his son's loneliness, and about how this dog's calm presence might bring comfort. Without a second thought, he made the decision. "I'll take him," Daniel said firmly. When Daniel brought the dog home, Ethan's eyes widened. For a moment, his sadness seemed to lift. He looked at the German shepherd with surprise, as if he could not believe what he was seeing. The dog walked straight to Ethan's wheelchair, sat beside him, and laid his head gently on the boy's lap. Ethan's hands trembled as he stroked the dog's fur, and a small smile appeared on his lips. It was the first genuine smile Daniel had seen in months. From that day on, things began to change slowly in the house. The dog, whom Ethan named Max, refused to leave the boy's side. Whether Ethan was reading, eating, or simply sitting by the window, Max stayed close, offering silent companionship. When Ethan dropped something, Max tried to pick it up. When Ethan seemed sad, Max would nudge his arm or rest his head on his lap until the boy laughed softly. For Daniel, it was like watching a miracle unfold. He noticed Ethan's laughter returning, his eyes brighter, his voice lighter. The boy spoke more, dreamed more, and began to talk about the future again. The neighbors who once whispered about pity now looked at the house with curiosity, wondering how the boy seemed so alive again. They saw him in the garden with his father and Max, his wheelchair surrounded by happiness instead of silence. But while the days grew brighter, Daniel knew challenges still lay ahead. Therapy was still slow and Ethan's body remained weak. Yet for the first time there was hope in their home. Max had become more than a pet. He had become part of the family, a silent healer for a broken heart. What Daniel did not yet know was that this decision, the choice to adopt a German Shepherd, would soon lead to moments so shocking, so powerful, that they would change not only Ethan's life but also touch the hearts of everyone around them. This was only the beginning of a story that no one in the town would ever forget. The first few days with Max, the German Shepherd, were full of quiet discovery. Ethan, who had grown used to silence and loneliness, suddenly found himself with a constant companion. At first, he did not know how to act. He would sit in his wheelchair, watching Max circle the room or lie on the carpet. The boy's fingers would twitch with nervousness when Max came close. He had always dreamed of having a dog, but now that the dream stood right in front of him, it felt almost unreal. Max seemed to sense the hesitation. Instead of forcing himself on the boy, he kept his distance, showing patience. He would sit near the wheelchair, but not too close, glancing up at Ethan with those calm brown eyes. If Ethan looked back, Max would wag his tail gently, as if asking permission to get closer. Slowly, day by day, the space between them began to shrink. One afternoon, as Daniel prepared tea in the kitchen, he heard laughter. Light, surprised laughter that he had not heard from his son in months. He rushed to the living room and found Ethan holding a small ball in his lap. Max was standing on his hind legs trying to reach the ball, his ears perked, his tail swishing happily. Ethan threw the ball across the room with what little strength he had, and Max ran after it, returning it proudly to the boy's lap. The laughter that filled the room was like music to Daniel's ears. He stood in the doorway, tears forming in his eyes. From that day forward, a bond began to grow between Ethan and Max. The boy started to talk to Max as though he understood every word. "Do you think I'll ever walk again?" he would whisper while stroking Max's fur. The dog would respond with a quiet gaze and a soft lick on his hand as though answering, "I believe in you." Ethan began to feel that even if the world doubted him, Max never would. The neighbors, who often saw Ethan sitting silently by the window, now began to notice changes. One morning, Mrs. Wilson from next door stopped Daniel in the street. "Your boy looks different these days," she said kindly. "He looks alive again. That dog of yours is special." Daniel smiled and nodded, though inside he knew it was more than just the dog. It was hope returning to his son's life. Max also revealed an intelligence that amazed everyone. He quickly learned to bring Ethan small objects. If Ethan dropped a book or a toy, Max would gently pick it up in his mouth and place it back on his lap. When the doorbell rang, Max would bark once and then rush back to Ethan as if reporting the news. Even Daniel was surprised at how quickly the dog adapted, almost as though he had been waiting all his life for a purpose. Therapy sessions also changed. Ethan used to resist them, often complaining of pain or tiredness. But once Max began to join, everything felt different. Max would sit by Ethan's side as the therapist worked with him. Whenever Ethan groaned or sighed, Max would nudge his hand or let out a short bark of encouragement. The boy began to push himself harder, as if he did not want to disappoint his loyal friend. The therapist noticed the change and told Daniel, "Your son is working harder now. That dog is motivating him in ways no one else could." Still, not everything was easy. One evening, Ethan tried to roll his wheelchair toward the kitchen, but one of the wheels stuck against a rug. He grew frustrated and tears filled his eyes. "I'm useless," he muttered, his voice trembling. Daniel's heart broke hearing those words, but before he could rush to comfort him, Max acted. The German Shepherd barked sharply, ran to the wheelchair and tugged at the rug until it freed the wheel. Ethan gasped in surprise. Max then stood tall beside him, wagging his tail proudly. Ethan wiped his tears and whispered, "You saved me again." That night, Ethan fell asleep with his hand resting on Max's fur. As weeks passed, Max became part of every routine. In the mornings, he would wake Ethan by gently pawing at his blanket. During meals, he would sit patiently beside the wheelchair, watching over him. When Daniel pushed Ethan outside into the garden, Max followed closely, never straying far. The bond was no longer just growing, it was unbreakable. One sunny weekend, Daniel decided to take Ethan and Max to the park. He thought the fresh air and wide open space might cheer his son even more. The park was filled with families, children running, and people walking their dogs. Daniel pushed Ethan's wheelchair along the path while Max trotted beside them, alert and proud. At first, Ethan felt shy seeing other children run freely. A shadow of sadness crossed his face. But Max noticed it and immediately ran ahead, chasing a butterfly. His playful movements caught Ethan's attention, and soon the boy laughed again, clapping his hands. Some of the children came over, curious about Max. They asked to pet him, and Max allowed them politely, but he never left Ethan's side. The children admired how loyal the dog was, and for the first time, Ethan felt included rather than different. Daniel watched the scene with warmth. His son was no longer the lonely boy trapped in silence. He was smiling, talking, and even making friends. It felt like a miracle he had once thought impossible. But the real test of Max's devotion came unexpectedly. As they rested near the edge of the park, Daniel stepped away briefly to buy water from a nearby stand. He glanced back every few seconds to make sure Ethan was fine. For a moment he relaxed, but then disaster struck. A group of children playing nearby accidentally kicked a ball that rolled under Ethan's wheelchair. Without realizing, Ethan leaned forward slightly and the wheelchair began to move down the sloped path. Panic filled the boy's eyes as the chair rolled faster toward the busy street below. People screamed, pointing, but no one was close enough to stop it. Daniel dropped the bottles in his hands and ran with all his strength, his heart racing. But even as he ran, he knew he might not reach his son in time. In that split second, Max leapt into action. With a fierce bark, he charged after the wheelchair. His powerful legs carried him faster than any human could run. He reached the chair just as it neared the bottom of the slope. Biting firmly onto the handle of the wheelchair, Max planted his paws on the ground, dragging his body to slow the chair. His muscles strained, his claws dug into the pavement, and with all his strength he managed to bring the chair to a stop just inches from the street. The crowd gasped. Some clapped, others rushed forward in shock. Daniel arrived seconds later, breathless and trembling. He fell to his knees, hugging Ethan, who was pale but safe. Tears filled his eyes as he whispered, "Thank God. Thank you, Max." The German shepherd, panting but calm, licked Ethan's hand reassuringly. People gathered around, amazed. Some took videos. Others praised the dog's bravery. Strangers told Daniel he was lucky to have such a loyal companion. But for Daniel, it was more than luck, it was destiny. He realized that adopting Max was not just a choice of kindness. It was as though fate had placed this dog in their lives for a reason. That night back at home, Ethan refused to let Max leave his side even for a moment. He kept his hand resting on the dog's back, whispering, "You're my hero." Daniel sat in his chair watching his son and the dog. For the first time in years, he felt something deeper than hope. He felt faith that life still held surprises and perhaps even miracles for his son. Little did they know, this was only the beginning. Max had already saved Ethan once, but the greatest change he would bring to their lives was still to come. The park incident spread quickly through the small town. People could not stop talking about how a German shepherd had saved a paralyzed boy's life. Some even posted the video online, and within days it was shared by hundreds of strangers. Neighbors, friends, and even people Daniel barely knew stopped him in the street to praise Max's courage. But for Daniel and Ethan, the greatest reward was not the attention. It was the deep trust that now bound them to their new companion. Ethan especially felt different. Before Max, he often saw himself as helpless, a boy who had to depend on others for everything. But after the near accident, he realized that someone believed in him with such loyalty that even danger could not break it. That someone was not a person, it was Max. The dog had risked himself without hesitation, and that made Ethan feel like he was no longer weak or forgotten. He was worth protecting. He was worth loving. Every morning, Ethan woke up eager to see Max's face. He no longer dragged through the day in silence. Instead, he talked more, laughed more, and even argued playfully with his father about small things. Daniel noticed his son's energy rising, almost as if Max had lit a spark inside him. The bond deepened further when Max began showing an unusual ability during Ethan's therapy sessions. One morning, while the therapist was working with Ethan's legs, Max watched closely. As the therapist asked Ethan to try moving his foot slightly, Max suddenly barked and nudged Ethan's leg with his nose. The boy giggled and tried harder, and to everyone's surprise, his toes twitched faintly. The therapist gasped. "That's new," she said. "He hasn't done that before." Ethan's eyes widened in wonder. "Max, did you see that?" "I moved." The dog barked once, almost as if answering yes. Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. Was it possible that Max was not only a friend but also a healer in some hidden way? From then on, Max seemed to join every therapy exercise as though he understood the goal. When Ethan tried to lift his hand, Max would place a ball gently on it, waiting until the boy tried to squeeze. When Ethan attempted to push himself upright, Max stood beside him, nudging his back with steady pressure as though giving strength. Slowly, Ethan began to respond with more effort, surprising both the therapist and his father. Weeks turned into months and small improvements appeared. Ethan's fingers, once stiff and unresponsive, began to curl slightly when Max encouraged him. His shoulders grew stronger, allowing him to sit more upright in his chair. The doctors were amazed. "This is unusual," one of them said to Daniel. "Progress like this is rare at this stage. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Daniel smiled quietly, knowing the answer. It was Max. Outside the clinic, Ethan's confidence also grew. He started joining neighborhood children during their outdoor games, even though he could not run like them. Max made sure he was never left out. When the children played fetch, Ethan threw the ball weakly and Max raced after it, bringing it back proudly, making the boy laugh louder than anyone else. The other kids admired the bond and welcomed Ethan into their circle, no longer treating him as the boy in the wheelchair, but as their friend. One evening, Daniel found his son sitting by the window, whispering softly to Max. "Do you think I can walk one day?" Ethan asked. Max tilted his head, wagged his tail, and barked once as if to say, "Yes, you can." Ethan smiled, then looked at his father, who was standing quietly nearby. "Dad, Max believes in me. So I believe too." Daniel's eyes grew misty. For years he had prayed for such words. Hearing them from his son gave him strength he had not felt in a long time. The bond between Ethan and Max did not go unnoticed in the wider community. The school principal invited Daniel to bring Ethan and Max to an assembly. At first, Daniel hesitated, afraid his son might feel embarrassed in front of so many people. But Ethan insisted, "I want them to meet Max. I want them to know he's my best friend." On the day of the assembly, the gym was filled with children, teachers, and parents. When Ethan was wheeled in with Max trotting proudly beside him, the room fell silent. The principal introduced them and shared the story of how Max had saved Ethan in the park. The children clapped and some even cheered. Ethan blushed but smiled, feeling like he belonged. For the first time, he was not the boy people pitied. He was the boy with the brave dog. After the assembly, several children came to pet Max and talk to Ethan. One girl said, "You're lucky." "I wish I had a friend like Max," Ethan replied with confidence. "You will one day. Everyone deserves a friend like him." His words touched the teachers deeply. Back at home, Daniel began to notice something even more surprising. During one therapy session at the house, Ethan leaned forward, struggling to reach a toy on the floor. Max nudged his arm, encouraging him. To everyone's shock, Ethan managed to shift slightly in his chair and stretch further than before. Daniel and the therapist exchanged stunned glances. "He's improving faster than expected," the therapist whispered. As the weeks rolled on, Ethan's movements became clearer. They were small, sometimes barely noticeable, but they were there. Max seemed to know exactly when to push him harder and when to simply comfort him. It was as though the dog could sense the boy's limits and gently help him cross them. One night, Daniel sat in the living room, watching his son and Max sleeping together. Ethan's hand rested on Max's back, his face peaceful. Daniel thought back to the day he had first walked into the shelter. He realized now that it had not been chance. Something greater had guided him to that moment, to that dog, and to this change in his son's life. But life had more surprises in store. One rainy afternoon, when thunder echoed in the distance, Ethan felt anxious. Storms always made him nervous. Max sat close, pressing against his wheelchair. Ethan whispered, "If you're here, I'm not scared." As the storm raged, Ethan tried an exercise his therapist had given him, to push against the armrests and attempt to lift his body slightly. To his amazement, he managed to raise himself just a little. It was only for a second, but it was more than he had ever done before. He gasped, and Daniel, who had been watching, nearly dropped his tea. "Did you see that?" Ethan cried. His voice was trembling, but his eyes were filled with hope. Max barked joyfully as if celebrating the victory. Daniel rushed over, hugging his son tightly. "Yes, I saw it, and I will never forget it." From that moment, Ethan grew determined. He began to practice more, not only during therapy but also at home. Max became his partner in every attempt, standing beside him, barking encouragement, or gently nudging him forward. The bond was no longer just friendship. It had become a lifeline, a bridge between despair and hope, between silence and laughter, between giving up and fighting forward. And though no one could predict the future, one truth was clear. Max had already changed Ethan's world in ways no one else could. But what lay ahead was beyond what anyone could imagine. The boy who once thought he would never rise again was about to surprise everyone, even himself. The stormy afternoon when Ethan managed to lift his body, even for just a second, became the turning point of everything. It was a small movement, but for Ethan and Daniel, it felt like a mountain had shifted. For years, doctors had told them that progress would be minimal, almost invisible. Yet now, with Max's encouragement, Ethan had proved that hope was stronger than prediction. From that day, Ethan's determination grew brighter. He no longer treated therapy as a chore. Instead, it became his mission. Each morning, before Daniel even had the chance to wake him fully, Ethan was already asking, "Can we try today? Can Max help me again?" The boy's eyes carried a spark that had been absent for years, and Daniel's heart filled with gratitude every time he saw it. Max, too, seemed to understand that something important was happening. He became more alert during exercises, his body tense with focus whenever Ethan tried to move. If the boy's hands trembled while gripping a walker, Max would steady him with a gentle nudge. If Ethan leaned too far, Max barked sharply, warning him to balance. And when Ethan succeeded in even the smallest task, Max wagged his tail wildly, barking joyfully, as though celebrating a great victory. One afternoon, during a home therapy session, Ethan tried something new. The therapist had brought a special standing frame that supported his legs while he attempted to push upward. Ethan's face was red with effort, sweat forming on his forehead, but he pushed with all his strength. At that exact moment, Max barked and pressed against the frame, almost as if lending him courage. To everyone's amazement, Ethan managed to straighten his body more than he ever had before. The therapist clapped her hands in disbelief. "He's standing taller than last week. This is real progress." Daniel covered his face with his hands, tears streaming silently. He had prayed for this day, and now it was happening right before his eyes. News of Ethan's progress began to spread through the neighborhood. Friends and neighbors who once pitied Daniel now spoke of him with admiration. They said, "That boy is a fighter, and that dog is a gift from heaven." Some even came to visit, bringing small gifts for Ethan and treats for Max. The once quiet and heavy home now echoed with laughter, encouragement, and a new energy that no one could ignore. At school, Ethan grew braver. With Max always by his side, he no longer feared being different. Teachers noticed that his answers in class became more confident, and his classmates often gathered around to hear his stories. Ethan would tell them about Max's clever tricks, how he fetched books, carried small bags, and even turned on the light switch with his nose. The children were amazed, and Ethan felt proud to share something that made him special. Daniel, meanwhile, found himself reflecting late at night. He would sit at the kitchen table, staring at the papers from doctors that once spoke only of limitations. Those words now felt like shadows compared to the light he saw in his son's eyes. He whispered prayers of thanks, knowing deep in his heart that adopting Max had been guided by something greater than chance. As weeks passed, Ethan's physical strength continued to improve. He still relied on his wheelchair, but he could now grip the walker with more control. During one therapy session, the therapist suggested trying a short step with assistance. Ethan hesitated, fear clouding his face. "What if I fall?" he asked quietly. Daniel knelt in front of him, placing his hands on his son's shoulders. "Then you'll get back up, and Max and I will always be here to catch you." Ethan looked at Max, who sat watching with steady eyes, and felt a surge of courage. With deep breaths, he placed his weight forward, guided by the therapist. His legs trembled, his arms shook, but then one small step. It was shaky, but it was real. The room erupted in cheers. Daniel shouted with joy. The therapist clapped, and Max barked proudly. Ethan himself burst into laughter, tears streaming down his face. "I did it," he cried. That single step felt like a leap across a canyon of despair. After that day, Ethan pushed himself harder. Every attempt was painful, every movement slow, but he refused to give up. Max never left his side. When Ethan practiced with the walker in the living room, Max trotted beside him as if guarding him from danger. At night, when Ethan's muscles ached and he doubted himself, Max rested his head on the boy's lap, silently telling him, "You are not alone soon." Daniel decided to share Ethan's progress with the extended family. He invited them for a small gathering at their house. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandparents all arrived, curious to see the boy who had once been thought hopeless. The living room buzzed with conversation as everyone settled in. Ethan sat in his wheelchair, nervous but excited, with Max beside him. After dinner, Daniel stood and said, "There's something I want you all to see." He turned to Ethan and asked, "Are you ready, son?" Ethan nodded firmly, gripping his walker. The room grew silent as everyone watched. Slowly, Ethan placed his feet on the ground. With Max's steady presence beside him and Daniel's hand near his shoulder, Ethan pushed himself up. His legs wobbled, but he rose. Gasps filled the room. Some relatives covered their mouths in shock. Others wiped tears from their eyes. Ethan stood taller than he had in years, his face glowing with pride. Then carefully he took one small step forward. The room erupted in applause and joyful cries. His grandmother wept openly, whispering, "It's a miracle." Ethan looked down at Max and whispered, "We did it!" The dog wagged his tail furiously, barking as though announcing the victory to the world. That night, after the guests had left, Daniel sat with Ethan and Max in the quiet living room. The father's eyes shone with gratitude. "Son, you are stronger than I ever imagined, and Max, he was sent to us for a reason." Ethan nodded, hugging Max tightly. "He's not just my dog. He's my best friend, my helper, my hero." From then on, the journey only grew more inspiring. Every week brought small but steady progress. Ethan practiced standing longer, taking more steps, and even learning to shift his weight with more control. Max continued to guide him patiently, always alert, always encouraging. The boy who once thought his life would be trapped in silence and stillness was now moving forward. The father who once lived with unending worry now lived with hope. And at the center of it all was a German shepherd whose loyalty and love had transformed despair into determination. But the most shocking moment was still to come, a moment that would not only change their lives forever, but also touch the hearts of everyone who heard their story. The night after the family gathering was unforgettable. Ethan lay in bed, his mind replaying the moment he stood in front of everyone. For years he had only dreamed of such a thing, but now it was real. He reached over to pat Max, who was curled up beside his bed. "We showed them," he whispered with a smile. Max lifted his head, wagged his tail softly, and gave Ethan's hand a gentle lick before closing his eyes again. Daniel sat in the living room long after Ethan had fallen asleep. He stared at the photographs on the wall, remembering the dark days when he had almost lost hope. Tonight he felt like a new man. His son was not only standing but also believing again, and none of it would have been possible without Max. The following weeks brought even more progress. Ethan's therapy became more intense, but instead of dreading it, he welcomed it. Every day he tried to push himself further, first standing for a few seconds, then taking several steps with the walker. Max never left his side. Sometimes when Ethan grew tired and wanted to give up, Max would bark sharply or nudge his leg, reminding him that he could do more. Other times, when Ethan felt pain and tears filled his eyes, Max would rest his head on the boy's lap, calming him until he was ready to try again. One morning, Daniel walked into the therapy room and froze in shock. Ethan was standing with his walker, but Daniel's eyes widened when he realized something more. His son was taking steps slowly, carefully, but without the therapist holding him. The therapist stood nearby, ready to help if needed, but Ethan was moving on his own, with Max walking proudly at his side. "Dad, look," Ethan cried, his voice trembling with excitement. "I can do it." Daniel dropped to his knees, tears spilling down his cheeks. "Yes, son, you can do it. You really can." He hugged Ethan tightly, his heart full of gratitude. Word of Ethan's progress spread even further. Soon the local newspaper wanted to cover the story. They interviewed Daniel, Ethan, and even filmed Max during a therapy session. The article was titled, "The Dog Who Brought a Boy Back to His Feet." People across town read it and were inspired. Strangers stopped Daniel on the street to say how much the story had touched their hearts. Some even said they were encouraged to adopt pets from shelters after reading about Max. But the most powerful moment came at Ethan's school. Months after the first assembly, the principal invited Ethan to return. This time not just to introduce Max, but to show his classmates something special. Ethan was nervous but determined. He wanted to prove to everyone and to himself that miracles were possible. On the day of the event, the school gym was filled with students, teachers, and parents. Daniel wheeled Ethan inside, with Max trotting beside him. The crowd clapped, remembering the boy and his loyal dog. But this time, Ethan had a surprise for them. Daniel helped Ethan position himself with the walker in the center of the gym. The room fell silent. Ethan gripped the handles tightly, his face full of concentration. Max stood on his right side, his body steady and alert. Slowly, Ethan began to push himself up. Gasps filled the air as he rose, his legs trembling but strong enough to hold him. Then, to everyone's amazement, he took one step, then another and another. The gym erupted in cheers. Children shouted his name, teachers clapped, and some parents wiped tears from their eyes. Ethan's smile shone brighter than ever before. He looked down at Max and whispered, "We did it, buddy," the German shepherd barked proudly, as though announcing their victory to the whole world. After that day, Ethan was no longer seen as just the boy in the wheelchair. He became a symbol of courage and hope. His classmates treated him with admiration, asking him to join activities and inviting him to games and projects. He was included, not left out, and through it all, Max stayed beside him, always watchful, always loyal. At home, life changed in beautiful ways. Daniel found himself laughing more, smiling more, and even daring to think about his own dreams again. But above all, he felt proud of his son's spirit. Ethan had taught him that even in the darkest times, light could return if one refused to give up. Months later, the family was invited to a community event, honoring acts of bravery. Max was given a special medal for saving Ethan's life in the park. The mayor placed it around his neck while the crowd clapped and cheered. Ethan held Max tightly, tears in his eyes, whispering, "You deserve this more than anyone." That evening, as they walked home, Daniel felt overwhelmed by the journey they had taken. From despair to hope, from silence to laughter, from stillness to steps, the transformation was beyond anything he had imagined. He looked at his son, who now walked slowly but proudly with the walker, and at Max, who walked faithfully beside him. "Son," Daniel said softly, "when I adopted Max, I thought I was saving him, but now I know he was sent to save us." Ethan nodded, hugging Max once more. "He gave me back my life, Dad. He gave us both hope." The story of Ethan and Max did not end there. Every day brought new challenges, but also new victories. Ethan continued to grow stronger, determined to walk more independently. Doctors who once doubted now called his progress extraordinary. Neighbors who once pitied now admired. And Daniel, who once lived with endless worry, now lived with pride and joy. Years later, people in the town still remembered the tale of the boy and his dog. They spoke of how a simple act of kindness, a father adopting a German shepherd from a shelter, had changed everything. It was not just a story of recovery. It was a story of love, loyalty, and the belief that miracles can happen when hope is kept alive. In the quiet of their home, Ethan often sat by the window with Max at his side. He no longer looked out with sadness. Instead, he looked out with dreams, dreams of walking freely one day, dreams of growing into a man who would inspire others. And he knew deep in his heart that Max would always be part of that journey. For Daniel, watching his son laugh, play, and walk again, even if slowly, was more than enough. He no longer felt the weight of despair. Instead, he felt the strength of faith. He realized that the most powerful miracles often come not through grand events, but through small steps. Loyal hearts and the courage to never give up, and so, their story became a living reminder that love can heal, hope can restore, and sometimes, the friend who changes everything walks into your life on four legs, with a wagging tail and eyes full of loyalty.